All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really zeroing in on one specific audio source. It gets into some pretty deep questions about government, authority.
That's right. And this source, it really puts forward a very particular viewpoint on how belief in authority works, or maybe how it doesn't work, and what the source claims are these, well, really problematic consequences, unexpected ones even.
Yeah, so our mission here is just to unpack the source's main arguments. We want to understand the logic it's presenting, look at the claims it makes about where authority comes from, and follow where the source says that leads.
And it's probably worth mentioning, like right up top, the speaker and the source makes it clear they're coming at this from personal experience. They actually call themselves someone who used to believe strongly in the state. It adds a certain layer, I think.
Definitely. Former devout status, that's the term they use. And this source, it doesn't pull any punches. Right away, it hits you with this, well, pretty startling claim that believing in authority isn't just wrong, but actually irrational, insane is a word they use, and that this belief inevitably creates what the source calls all-powerful bad guys.
So, yeah, just to be clear for everyone listening, today is all about exploring this specific perspective from this one source. We're tracing their line of argument to see how they get to these, frankly, very strong conclusions.
Okay, so let's start with that personal side you mentioned.
Yeah.
The source really leans into this. The speaker talks about being that former devout status, someone who didn't just believe, but actively promoted the mythology of government for, well, most of their life.
Yeah, they want you to know this isn't some outsider just throwing rocks. This is someone who was, fully bought in.
Yeah.
And getting out of what they term this authoritarian indoctrination, it wasn't easy for them, not just an intellectual flip-flop.
No, not at all. They talk about letting go of this superstition, their word, happening kind of slowly and reluctantly. And they use this dramatic phrase, like lots of intellectual kicking and screaming along the way. It sounds like they felt they were attacking their own core beliefs.
hmm So where does the source say this whole idea of authority even starts? It points to a basic fear, the fear that, well, people just don't agree. They have different beliefs, different morals, different ideas about how things should be.
And that's a relatable fear, isn't it?
Hmm.
What if we can't agree on basic right and wrong? The source sums it up like, what if there's no government and somebody thinks it's okay to kill me and steal my stuff? That kind of fundamental worry.
Exactly. The source isn't denying that conflicts happen because people disagree, but it says this fear is precisely what gives rise to what it labels the authoritarian solution.
Okay, the authoritarian solution. Can you walk me through how the source lays that out?
Sure. So the idea is because individuals might disagree or, act badly, the answer people come up with is let's create one central authority.
All right, a single entity. And its job is to make the rules. One set of rules.
One set of rules, and this is key to enforce those rules on absolutely everyone. It's positioned, the source says, as the way to fix that initial problem, that fear of chaos from differing views.
But this is exactly where the source starts pushing back, isn't it? It asks a pretty direct question, something like, why should we assume that rules made by humans in the source is quite pointed, calling them potentially exceptionally power-hungry, corrupt human beings? Why would their rules be inherently better or more just than individual choices?
Yeah, the source argues that people often talk about government as if it will be fair, rational, just, in ways that individuals often aren't. And the source claims this shows we project these sort of superhuman virtues onto authority. We expect it to be wiser and more moral than mere mortals.
As the source says, history shows otherwise. That's their counterpoint.
So following that logic, the source argues that authority doesn't actually make people agree or resolve things peacefully. Instead, it gives them a tool to massively escalate disagreements.
Wow. Escalating personal issues into large-scale wars and mass oppression.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge claim the source is making.
It's a very serious claim. And they use this really stark comparison. They say, okay, maybe one person with a really twisted morality kills a few people, maybe dozens, but give that same twisted morality control to what the source calls the machine called government, and suddenly you're talking about millions dead, historically speaking. The potential for harm just explodes, according to this source.
Right. The scale changes completely.
Exactly.
And this gets us to what the source calls out as a kind of deep paradox or irony. People are looking for this all-powerful good guy to fix the initial fear, to save a day. But in doing so, the source claims they keep creating all-powerful bad guys.
It paints this picture where these huge government structures, these monsters, as the source puts it, are built with good intentions, to
Yeah.
protect us, defend us. But then, again and again, according to the source's reading of history, these very protectors become a bigger threat to ordinary people than the original problems ever were.
Which ties directly into this core idea the source hammers home, the legitimization of evil.
Yeah, this is central. The source argues that believing in authority isn't just like a mistake, it's the actual mechanism that introduces more immoral violence into society. And they're really clear. This isn't a bug, it's not an accident. The source calls it a truism based upon the nature of the belief in authority. It's built in from their perspective.
Okay, to really get why they see it like that, the source has us look at the idea of physical force. It starts somewhere most people would probably agree.
Right. We generally get that some force is okay, some isn't. Like aggressive force starting violence, theft, assault, murder, fraud, vandalism. That's generally seen as wrong, as bad force.
Makes sense. And then there's defensive force, using force to stop that aggression, protect yourself or others. That's widely seen as okay, justified, good force.
Uh-huh. Now, here's the crucial step the source takes. It defines good force, specifically, as the kind of force that anyone already has a right to use in self-defense or defense of others, and bad force is anything involving force that ordinary people do not have a moral right to just go and do.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. How does that connect back to the government, to authority, in the source's view?
Well, the argument is that people imagine agents of the state, police, military, whoever, have the right to use force not just in those good force defensive situations anyone could use, but in other situations too. Think about things like taxation, conscription, enforcing regulations where no initial aggression, as they define it, has occurred.
Okay. So if good force is what everyone can rightly do anyway, and authority gives agents permission to use force beyond that,
Okay.
then the source concludes that law itself is basically an attempt to make bad force look legitimate.
That's exactly their conclusion, which leads them to define authority, very starkly, as permission to commit evil. Permission to do things that, if you or I did them, everyone would call it immoral, criminal even.
And working from that definition, the source then takes aim specifically at democracy.
Right. They argue democracy isn't some path to freedom or justice. They call it nothing more than majority-approved immoral violence.
Wow. Majority-approved immoral violence.
Yeah.
That doesn't leave much room for interpretation. And voting, in this view.
Voting itself legitimizes aggression and unjustified violence, according to the source. They essentially say the logic against it is so straightforward from their viewpoint that it requires a constant barrage, an enormous amount of propaganda to convince people otherwise, to make them think voting is somehow upholding freedom when the source sees it as endorsing coercion.
So if we kind of tie all these threads together from the source, its fundamental point seems to be that the entire concept of government relies on this one idea: that actions considered morally wrong for you or me suddenly become morally right if someone with a badge or official title does them.
Exactly. Which, they argue, implicitly treats those agents as operating under different moral rules. It circles back to that idea of them being seen as, well, almost superhuman, not bound by normal morality.
And bringing you back to their definitions of force one last time, the good defensive force doesn't need a government or a law to be morally okay. Anyone can do that when justified.
It's inherently righteous in their framework. So the source concludes the only thing a law and government are actually needed for is to try and legitimize the other kind of force, the kind that isn't inherently righteous.
Which leads straight to their final, pretty damning summary statement. Government adds, and the only thing government adds to society, more inherently unjust violence.
Yeah. And the source leaves off on this topic by saying, basically, if you truly understand and accept this argument, this perspective, well, then you couldn't possibly claim government is somehow vital or essential for civilization.
Well, this source definitely throws down a gauntlet to conventional ways of thinking. It's arguing belief in authority is irrational at its core, that authority is the claim to use force others can't rightfully use, and that this setup inherently adds more immoral violence rather than solving conflict fairly.
It really does push you to question assumptions, doesn't it? Assumptions about power structures we live with every day, maybe without really examining the foundations. The source is asking you, the listener, to chew on the implications of its logic.
And maybe here's a final thought, stemming from the source's perspective, for you to consider. If we follow the source's premise just for a moment, that authority fundamentally involves granting some people permission to do things that are considered immoral for everyone else, What might that tell you about the very nature of power itself?